actually had class, because last week the Campbells were here and did a presentation on the work that is going on in Ecuador. So just to recap where we were, as an overarching theme, we're going through a study on the book of Job. The last several weeks we've been focusing kind of on a study within that study, talking about evil and suffering, and specifically discussing, whether, based off of the book by Thomas Warren, Have Atheists Proved There Is No God, talking about the argument that some people make about how the fact that there's evil and pain and suffering in this world shows that there's no God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible claims to be all good and all powerful, but evil exists. So there seems to be a contradiction there. And we've gone through that pretty extensively in discussing why that's not the case, and why evil exists. So more recently, we've been talking about why does pain and suffering exist, and how does that relate to our lives as Christians and to the existence of God, and that argument. A couple weeks ago, I don't know exactly how far back now, but we started talking about, so what was God's purpose in creating this world? From our viewpoint, what would God's purpose be for creating this world? And we said that the Bible clearly teaches that God created us, and he created the world for us as a veil of soul-making. That's what Thomas Warren calls it, a veil of soul-making, or a place where we can choose, have the option of whether we're going to serve God or not. And there has to be certain conditions met, or the world had to be created in a certain way in order for that to be the case. Because if God were present, like full on in our face all the time, we wouldn't really have much of an option. Or if God were so far away that you couldn't recognize him, then you wouldn't have any way to know him or to get to him. Along with that, if there were no option to choose to serve him or not, then it wouldn't work. Like if it were just, it wouldn't work for that purpose. So the world has to have certain characteristics, and we talked about that. It's a world in which it can't be a world in which we can only experience pleasure. Like it has to be a world in which pain and adversity can come about on us. It also needs to be one which allows us to be free moral agents, which means that we have the choice as to whether we're going to do right or wrong. It would provide for our basic needs while also providing challenges to our intellectual power, and also to our physical power. It would have enough pleasure and goodness so that we could see, what the goodness of God and long for a permanent home with God. And it must allow for us to correctly deduce that he exists, provide enough evidence that God exists, without overwhelming us there again, with forcing the issue. It would allow us to choose to live as children of God possibly at a high price, or to not follow his will. And it would also be one in which things are important, seemingly important in our lives, but at the same time are not necessarily important in eternity. Like, for instance, there are things that happen every day in our lives that are of extreme importance to us, but in the grand scale of things, it's a very small thing when you compare it to eternity. So it allows for both of those situations to occur. So we talked about, does the world possess these characteristics? And how maybe someone might claim that the world would be better if no natural calamities ever occurred, or if there was no animal pain, or if there were no human suffering, or if there was no instances of sin. So we talked through, if that were to be the case, it would have to be, the world would not exist as we know it. It couldn't possibly exist as we know it. So then we started talking about, from there, a little bit more about suffering and what purpose does that serve. And we talked about some natural disasters, right? Things like hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, those kind of things, and what purpose they might serve. And the main thing there is that it shows they show uncertainty. We can't depend on anything, any material blessings or things in this world. Those things will, material things come and go, and we shouldn't rely on them. They're very temporary. Also, those kind of disasters show us that life is uncertain. We don't know what our last day is going to be. So the uncertainty, the element of uncertainty is served through those natural disasters. Also, we talked a little bit about animal pain and the way that the animal kingdom is set up, and how those kind of purposes, and the fact that God put people over animals whenever He created, and we saw back in Genesis that was said. So that's not to say that bad treatment of animals is a good thing. Like, I don't think anybody would argue that we should treat animals in the right way. But the Bible does say that people are over animals. So, and we see the animal kingdom that what is it? Survival of the fittest. Some animals eat other animals and those kind of things. So we don't know exactly to what level animals. We know that they do feel pain, but we don't know how we just don't know, because we're not animals in that way. We don't know exactly how they feel things, or what that is. But there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from what we see in animals, and we talked about in Proverbs some of those examples that we can see from animals and from just life in general, the hierarchy and things like that. So I think that's pretty much where we had gotten to as we were talking about the way this world's created and suffering within the world. So the last thing then that Warren focuses in on is he claims that every instance of human suffering results from some condition which was necessary to God's providing man with the ideal environment for soul making. He adds that God is not blameworthy for having created a world in which there seems to be dystological suffering, which I think dystological just means pointless or without purpose, where we don't necessarily know that purpose. What purpose would human suffering serve in making the world a perfect environment for soul making? And you guys don't have to answer that right away, but it's something to think about. Like, what is the purpose of human suffering when it comes to the world being the perfect place for us to have the opportunity to decide whether we're going to serve God or not serve God? And first off, I guess, what one needs to think about, what are some of the causes of human suffering that we've already talked about? You guys remember? Sin. So we can cause our own problems by doing things that we're not supposed to do. That's for certain. What are some other things that can cause suffering? People can become sick. Disease. What's natural disasters? We can be hurt by what we just talked about: hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, lightning, heat waves. There's a number of things that we can be harmed by. Animals. Talked about animals. Lots of people are killed by various types of animals: snake bites, spiders, bears, whatever, different things. What else? What's that? Death. By other people's death. Yeah, when we die, we're no longer harmed by it because but whenever those that we love or care about die, that harms, again, I don't know, it causes us to suffer, feel pain. We can be hurt by other people in different ways. You can be hurt emotionally by somebody that you care about lying to you or being unfaithful to you or things like that. You can be hurt by somebody who robs you. We as a group can be collectively hurt by somebody going to an unjust war or different, what costs Americans a lot of money? Can you think of what kind of theft costs all of us a lot of money every year? Fraud, especially insurance fraud, right? Or fraud against the government programs and things like that. That costs us all a lot of money. So we can feel pain from that. There's a lot of different things that we can be hurt by, and we can be hurt by as we mentioned before, our own carelessness or indifference or our own wrongdoings. Especially carelessness. That's a big one. That's not necessarily doing wrong, but how many people end up losing, a finger or an arm or a leg or something from being careless, in their work? That's something that's really emphasized where I work, is about doing a job safety analysis and making sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. If you're working on equipment, you're supposed to lock it out, make sure nobody can turn it on. If you're, when you're supposed to be lifting something, you got to analyze it and make sure you're doing it the right way and that everybody's clear of it. So there's lots of different safety things, and so that's something we sometimes don't even think about is our own carelessness in what we do. All right, so another question along these lines of what purpose does human suffering serve? As we try to build that, first off, we talked about, okay, well, what is the cause of it? So why does it exist? We've already discussed how the environment has to be a law-abiding one. Because we have physical bodies, there must be the possibility of occasions on which some sort of damage or destruction occurs. In other words, like I just said, we can have a limb cut off because of the laws of physics. When an axe is swung, if it's swung at you, there's going to be damage caused. We talked about what if God made it so that couldn't happen? Well, then an axe would have to somehow be able to cut through wood and then not be able to cut through you, and it just that doesn't work with the way the laws of physics and the way the world's created. As we talked about, much of our suffering is a consequence of sin. It occurs from the choices that we make or other people make, and that's where some of the problem comes in, right? There's a lot of suffering caused not by ourselves, but by the decisions other people are making. And you want to go back all the way, you can go back, and we'll talk about this again, and have talked about it, Adam and Eve. That starts the whole thing. We suffer because of the decision they made. And it's not really fair to blame them, because don't you think that probably somebody along the way would have made the same decision, even if it wasn't them? Because we have the choice, and that's what we keep coming back to. We have the choice. And of course, if we're truly to be free, it has to be possible for these things to occur. So evil people can bring about a lot of suffering on other people. All right, so another question along this line, what are some things that we can learn from pain and suffering?
If you reflect back, you can say, lessons learned. If you reflect back.
Yeah, if we have the opportunity to, yes, we can look back at things that we learn, like whenever you're a child and you touch something hot, you learn not to touch that again. So we can learn lessons through the pain that we feel. That can be a good thing and a bad thing, depending on what you're talking about. It can teach us, as we were talking about, certainty and uncertainty. It's certain that we're going to go through certain things, through pain, and things are going to happen. As we talked about, nobody gets out of life alive, right? The only way we're going to be alive at the end is if God comes back during the time, Jesus comes back during the time that we're alive. Otherwise, we know what our final destination is as people. He's got a lot to say there, yeah. And as we talked about, pain and suffering can teach us that life on earth is both significant and insignificant. In the grand scheme of things, what's one person out of billions? And yet, that one person is important to God, right? And of course, when you're talking about yourself, that one person is important to you or people in your life. So things are both important and not important, and depending on how you look at them. Having an eternal view, I guess, is what you might say with that, how important it is. But what's really important is whether or not we're going to follow God and how we're going to treat others while we're here. It is insignificant in that anything that we obtain or build here is only temporary and can be taken away. So suffering here is insignificant compared to the wonders we will receive in eternity with God. Let's look at Mark 8, 36 and 37. This is something that Jesus said about that viewpoint.
Okay. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul?
All right, so that Jesus is there saying, of course, what can we gain here that's worth losing our soul over? Is there anything that would be worth going to hell over? There's one place in the Bible where I think somebody says something close to that. Does anybody remember? Somebody says he says, I wish that I could be cursed. Not Job, nope. Paul, yeah, Paul says, I wish I could be cursed for what, and what was he saying there? For their sakes. That I'd rather, it's almost worth it for me if they could all be saved. That's the only place that I can think of in the Bible that talks about something along those lines of, but
that would be a sacrifice.
That would be a huge sacrifice, wouldn't it? Yeah, and of course he knows that's not, that he's using that as an example, saying, that's how much I care for them. You might call it hyperbole, that I care for them that much that I think that I would almost be willing to go to hell if they could all be saved, because there's so many more of them, you might be saying. But Paul's a great example of having that view, and I've talked about him before, the eternal view. When we're going through tough times here, or even good times here, realizing the temporary nature of what we're seeing here, and realizing that this is just really a testing period for us, where we get to choose whether we're going to obey God or not. And that, once we realize how important that is, that to me, that should really dictate how we live our lives and where we place the emphasis, what we place the emphasis on. Also, along those lines, pain and suffering can serve as a foretaste of the punishment of hell, like what we were talking about. Just like the good things that we see here, the fun things that we get to do, are a foretaste of the rewards that we will see in heaven. The pain and suffering that we see here allow us to kind of visualize or picture what it would be like to not have God in our lives, to not be a child of God. Warren also discusses some objections that might be raised about these conclusions that he's reaching in relation to human suffering. So what are some things that people say, or the problems that people have with human pain and suffering? What specifically, like, even if people accept all those things that we just talked about, like that the temporary nature, the uncertainty, the good things that pain allows us to know about, even if you accept all of that, there's still some questions related to, well, why certain things happen. What are some questions that you've heard, or some statements that you've heard made about pain and suffering that people say, well, if God, why does God allow this? Why I still struggle because God allows this to happen or whatever.
If it is a young person catching a disease or the untimely death of a young person, that's
So-
when people question at that time.
So health issues amongst the young people, what's the purpose of that? Why, or put another way, why do the innocent suffer, maybe you might say? Like why, and how is what we've talked about already kind of answered that question? To some degree. Keep in mind, anytime you're going through any of this, it's going to be tough, no matter what. Anytime you're going through something where a young person has died or a disease or something like that, or you're going through a health issue, any of those things are going to be tough on us. We know that. But what is the thing that we've talked about already that kind of says, well, why is that allowed to happen? Because of sin, and it's not geared toward it's not a punishment it's not a direct punishment for sin on that individual per se. Like we talked about, there are sins that there could be direct consequences for. Like we know that. But there is also just the general mankind, humans have fallen, we've sinned, therefore these things have entered the world. Disease entered the world. Those things. And that's what's being discussed in Job, what we're going to go back to, about like his friends are saying, you did something really bad because look at how much bad stuff's happening to you. And Job's like, no, I didn't. And he's arguing his case. I didn't do anything to deserve this. And we've seen, and we'll see that, yeah, things happen, that bad things happen to good people. And good things happen to bad people. It's not one way or the other, because once again, that goes back to this world is designed for us to be able to choose whether we're going to serve God or not. And if only good things happen to people who serve God and only bad things happen to people who didn't serve God, there wouldn't be any choice there. There wouldn't be any decision to be made. So some people will say that. Is there something else that you've heard besides that kind of thing? Or is that the main thing that you've heard?
I think that's the most common.
That's the most common thing, yep. And people really struggle with God, with their relationship with God whenever they've lost a loved one, especially when it's not expected. That can be really, really tough. So someone may object as to the distribution of suffering. What do you mean? What do I mean when I say distribution of suffering? What Warren says as to the distribution of suffering is that, one, the fact that no one can explain the teleological connection for each and every instance of suffering, or the purpose for each instance of suffering. Number two, the fact that infants and children, as we were just talking about, may suffer without being able to profit from it. Like how does a child getting cancer teach them a moral lesson? So that may be something that somebody might say. Or often righteous people suffer more than evil people who aren't obeying God. But we just talked about that. Like the distribution of suffering is not based off of how good we are or how bad we are. So no one can explain how every instance of human suffering serves God's purpose in bringing man to him. But we can see that God has a morally sufficient reason for having created a world in which human suffering can occur. And Jesus gives us a perfect example of this. Did Jesus do anything evil in his life? If you're a Christian, we don't believe that, right? We believe he was perfect. So let's read 1 Peter 2, 21 through 24.
1 Peter 2, 21 through 24. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die of sins and to live for righteousness.
Okay, so Jesus is our example, and if you're looking at this weighting of suffering versus being good or evil, that right there blows it out of the water, right? Because Jesus didn't commit any sin. He was perfect, and he suffered death on the cross for us. So I think Peter talks through inspiration about how that is an example for us and what we can expect. God does not let us suffer because of meanness or because of a lack of knowledge or power. God, we've already talked about that. God is all-powerful. He knows all things, and he's good. He's not mean, as you would say that. But, a lot of the objections that we're talking about come from the misconception that suffering is a punishment for sin, which, once again, in an overarching viewpoint, it is. But when you look at each individual instance of suffering, that may not be related to any specific sin that person committed or that we committed. It can, like I said, it can. There are times where these things can be connected, but not every single instance. And that's because God created the world in a way to allow for us to choose, to have these options. And in doing so, that free will comes into everything that you're talking about. The freedom to choose what we're going to do comes into everything. And we discussed this when we were talking about what Job's wife said to him. If you remember, we read John 9, 1 through 7. I want to have somebody read that at this time too. John 9, 1 through 7. Because that also this is Jesus again addressing addressing that.
As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing.
Okay, so they asked him, who sinned that this person was born blind? And what was Jesus' answer? Nobody. It was for that God could be glorified in this specific instance, with Jesus there. So both the righteous and the wicked suffer because there is a need for randomness as an element of suffering to make the world, the environment for God's purpose, for why he created the world. Someone may also object as to the amount of suffering. It may be referring to why is there any suffering at all, or why is there so much suffering in the world? And we've kind of already covered that in what we've discussed because of our free choice.
Well, we can throw it out there as because of evil man.
Right, because of people, yeah, and it's not something where it's not just rained down on one person or the other. It just, with the way that it's been set up, that these things happen, and it can be intense and prolonged at times. We can go through a lot of suffering. There also may be an objection as to failure. Someone may say, well, if suffering is related to God trying to turn us back to Him, or to teach us how to serve Him, then why do so many people reject God? And what's interesting here is, I think this goes back to Dave's question that he asked, which is kind of outside of my lesson. I hadn't really planned on going there, but Dave asked, why does it seem like it's so easy for us to do the wrong thing? So what was the answer that we kind of came up with? It's because we want what we want. It's our desire, and we want it. And, I mean, that's the simplistic answer. We went into more depth on it, but it's our desires. We put our desires above what God wants, above God's will. And that, when you have that option, that's what leads to these things. And actually I have something I want to read. I don't think we might have enough time for it today. We'll see here. But something that I want to read about we probably won't get to it today, but that kind of talks along those lines as to how that's happened. And we're getting to the conclusion here of this part of our series where we're talking about evil and suffering. So I just want to kind of go through, we really hit things hard and repeated a lot of things because I think these are important things that we need to be able to discuss with people because it's a legitimate question. It's a tough question to answer, these about evil and suffering, and we need to be prepared for a couple things. One, to go through it, and two, to be able to answer people's questions when they challenge the existence of God because of these things. So I want to just kind of sum it up here and kind of pull it all together. Some people believe that if God is all powerful and God is all good as he claims to be, there should be no evil or suffering. As we've discussed over the last several weeks, I think that the Bible itself counteracts this claim. As we get ready to end this part, which once again, we'll probably refer back a lot to this as we go through Job, but I want to read something from a book by Wayne Jackson. It's a pretty long reading here. I think I have enough time to do it. This book it's a fairly old book now. I think it was written this is in the 70s. I think it was the year I was born, actually. And it deals with some of this, some observations about atheism. And there's actually another section that I want to read in here too, but that we won't get till next week. So hopefully you guys can stay with me. I know it's hard whenever somebody just reads part of a book, but I think that he says a lot in here that's very much what we're talking about here, what we've been talking about, and has some good information, and it's still relevant information even though it was written a long time ago. So he says, in relation to science here, and science is important because if you've been paying any attention to our politics, and I'm not going to get into politics anything in detail because I try to avoid that, but there's been a lot of talk in various things about following the science in relation to climate change, coronavirus, lots of different things. And I just would encourage everybody to do their own research on that because a lot of what you're hearing is not accurate, and the people who are trying to follow the science, say they're following the science, are not following the science. So, without getting into any specifics or anything like that, just do your own research and look into things. Don't trust what you're hearing, as I've said many times, I think. Okay, so in relation to science, though, others believe that the advancement of modern science has rendered unbelief a valid philosophy of life. Has science become a sacred cow and the laboratory a holy of holies? Apparently, to many superficial thinkers, it has. Admittedly, we owe much to science, but science owes everything to God. Who created it? God did. Jehovah has not become obsolete. To the contrary, every scientific discovery has further glorified the Creator. Popular science writer Lincoln Barnett suggests that it is becoming increasingly difficult for scientists to solve their problems without recourse to God. And James Jauncey concurs, affirming that many scientists are returning to God as a final and only answer to the problems of the world. He says, in fact, that the atheist or the hostile agnostic, even in scientific circles, is becoming a rare bird indeed. Incidentally, Dr. Jauncey holds 10 academic degrees, including bachelor degrees in science, psychology, philosophy, and divinity, master's degrees in science, history, and divinity, doctor's degrees in mathematics and religion. Otis Gatewood calls attention to the fact that during the Apollo 10 moonshot, the statement was made on international television that 89% of the scientists engaged in the moonshot believed in God. It's amazing the way things have changed in a few years, right? I mean, I still don't know what percentage of scientists would claim to believe in God, but certainly some things have changed there. One of the astronauts read for all the world to hear, "In the beginning, God." When 89% of the world's best scientists agree on something, we may safely say it's scientifically accurate. There again, changes in the way things are being looked at today. One need not, therefore, surrender his faith because of alleged conflicts between faith and God and science. Conversely, we ought to rejoice in the advancement of science with the confidence that such will only be additional evidence of God's existence and majesty. And I think that that's continued to be the case for the last several years after this was written, that there hasn't been anything discovered that contradicts God. In fact, the Bible, it more confirms what we see in the Bible. And we'll talk more about that in Job, too, when we start talking about some of the things in Job. Okay, so before concluding this discussion on atheism, we feel compelled to call attention to the atheist's smug self-image of his totally scientific and rational outlook. There again, been hearing that a lot lately. He feels that faith is irrational and thus allegedly disassociates himself from such. The truth is, however, it actually requires more faith, and that of an unreasonable variety, to accept atheism than theism. The atheist does indeed have a faith. And that goes back, I think that's kind of similar to what I've said before about how, does it take more faith to think that somehow things came from nothing and that nothing caused it to be created than it does to think that there's a creator? Which makes more sense? Because we know, and this is what we'll get to in when I read some of this next week, the laws of physics, you can't get something from nothing. Something had to create it. So it takes a lot more faith to believe that we came from nothing by coincidence than it does to believe in God. I think that just seems to be logical. I don't know how they get around that. But they do. They try to anyway. All right, so James D. Bales discusses some of the articles of faith in the Atheist Creed in his book, Communism, Its Faith and Fallacies. The following is an adaptation of some of his points. Number one, though the atheist cannot prove it, he believes that God does not exist. To know that God does not exist, one would have to know everything and be everywhere. For the thing which he did not know might prove God's existence. He would have to know all the causes which have never operated for the one cause he did not know might be God. The person who possessed such a characteristic would be God himself. Thus, an atheist, to be consistent, must be an autotheist or a self-God. There are no real atheists, only self-worshiping idolaters who have defied their own beings. The atheist cannot reverse this argument and say that one must know all in order to have sufficient reason to believe in God. Several lines of evidence show that it is rational to accept God and irrational to reject God. We need to know at least some of the evidence, but we do not need to know everything. That goes back to where, people will say, well, you just say everything is faith, and you don't have any logical reason for what you believe. I think we do. I think we have very logical reasons for what we believe, but we don't know everything. We say that. As I mentioned going into this class, we don't have all the answers. We don't know everything. We don't claim to know everything. So you don't have to know everything in order to believe in God. You just have to look at the evidence and see it and come to a logical conclusion. Whereas on the flip side, they're trying to claim that they can know there's no God. Well, how can you know that? You can't. One
day we will know.
One day, yeah, everybody will know, right? Number two, the atheist ridicules the concept of an eternal God, yet he himself believes in the eternal existence of matter. His belief in the eternal existence of matter is not only without reasonable evidence. Oh, actually, I guess we are going to hit that right now. I didn't realize I was right here. It is contrary to one of the best established scientific laws, the second law of thermodynamics, which demonstrates that the universe is running down and hence had an origin. Also, it is much more reasonable to believe that that a mind, God in this case, produced matter, life, and human consciousness than to believe that matter created mind, consciousness, and intelligence. Once again, the design of the world. How did nothing create that? How could that have come to be if something didn't create it? Okay, well, it looks like I'm about out of time, and we still have a few of these to go. So we'll finish this up next week. We'll wrap up our entire series here on evil and pain and suffering next week and get back into Job. I don't know how long it'll take. it may be the next week, but we'll get back into Job either sometime next week or at the next week then. So hopefully, like I said, hopefully this series has been helpful in thinking through some things, some tough issues, and we'll wrap it up next week then. So thanks, everybody.